Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Cokerhook. And with me this evening, I'm pleased to tell you, is a gentleman who's been on my show a couple times before, Mr. John Renesch, who he's an author, he's a futurist, he's a business philosopher, an owner of several former businesses, and a gentleman that I've come to know and very much respect here over the last couple of years because of his perspective on how we can make things better for everybody. I'll just leave it at that for the moment. So, John, welcome back to the show here. Pleased to have you back here on Reference Point.
Yeah, good to be back.
So, I reached out to you, I don't know, 6 weeks or so ago because I came across, I think you had mentioned it in an email I got from you. You've got a new book that you published called The Great Growing Up, Being Responsible for Humanity's Future. And I thought, well, this looks interesting. Read the book and whatever. And I want to talk a lot about this book today because this concept of growing up as a species is something that I first heard in talking to you. And I want to understand more about how this came about for you and what it is that you think we can do and why that's such an important thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, The Great Growing Up, the title The Great Growing Up didn't really come up until the last stage of the publishing business as prone to. So I had 3 or 4 working titles before this one. But it just seemed to me in structuring the book with one, a vision for what the future that we could have, and then looking at all the things that impede that vision, that get in the way of that vision, looking at all the forces that are pushing us towards doing something, changing or dying, basically, and then all the forces that are pulling us towards that new vision. So we have a lot of things going for us if we just want to take a more mature approach to everything and be responsible for the whole of the species, not just individual self-interest.
Let's talk about that thing, maturity. I think that's a key word that you mentioned there. And I believe we talked about that last time you were on the show a year or so ago. Refresh our memory here with respect to what was it that was the awakening point for you and recognizing where are we as a species on the maturity cycle?
Well, this is nothing necessarily that I can say I have the authority on and I know, but I have spoken around the world at different places. And quite often I'll ask the audience, where do you think we are in our level of maturity as a species? A youngster? Some people, one or two people might put their hands up. Adolescents, lots of people put their hands up. Young adults, very few people put their hand up. Wise elder, nobody puts their hand up. So the world knows that we're in our adolescence as a species. And I have a colleague, Dwayne Elgin, that's done the same thing, and he actually has it caught on video. And it's amazing to see when it hits adolescence how many hands go up.
Yeah.
It's like almost, I'd say 80-90% of the audience are voting saying we're in our adolescence. So it's not a secret that I'm revealing to the world.
Right.
People know it. So it's just a question of stop acting or enduring or tolerating adolescent behavior and start taking responsibility like mature adults. It's just like growing up as a kid. You know, we don't have any choice to grow up and mature and become adults physically.
Right.
That's all taken care of beforehand. But we do have a choice of whether we want to grow up emotionally and psychologically and spiritually.
Do we have that choice, really?
Each of us has that choice.
Okay, so why are there not enough people making that choice, I guess is the question.
It's probably in the culture that we endure all this with each other. We put up with, as I said earlier to you privately, it isn't so much that there's a whole lot of bad people doing a lot of bad things and that's the reason for all the problems in the world. Mm-hmm. It's a few people are doing things that are furthering the dysfunction in the systems that we live in, and a much larger number of people aren't doing anything about it. They're not saying anything about it, they're not pointing it out, they're not interfering with it, they're saying, whoa, what are you doing here? You know, stop that. Mm-hmm. And they let that bad behavior keep escalating, and the spiral keeps going.
So you mentioned systems, and I guess just as a sort of, to broaden the scope for the folks that are watching this, and you and I had some conversation about this over dinner, we're talking about things that we as members of a social structure are involved with, because in these social systems, there's the education system, there's the economic system, there's the political system, there's the health care system, there's all kinds of activities and functions that are put in place by groups in order to theoretically help sustain the group and enable that group to grow, to become larger, better, more effective, etc. And so I think that one of the keys here that ties back to what you're talking about in the book is a recognition that many of these systems are not serving us at this point in time. But that's not just here. It's just like
It's all over.
it's a worldwide phenomenon.
Right.
Is that a fair
Yeah,
statement?
yeah. Many of the systems that we created many systems. When I say systems, I'm talking about human social systems.
Right.
I'm not talking about heating and air conditioning systems.
Right, right.
A lot of systems we have designed specifically and then allowed to get more and more dysfunctional as time goes on. But we intended them to do a certain job. And the idea of creating a system like that is to make it work easier, to, like we create a government to do the things that are for everybody's common good,
Right.
not just so everybody doesn't have to do it themselves. So some systems were created intentionally, and they've devolved into a level of dysfunctionality. I dare you to come up with any system that's functional right now that's over a year old anyway. Then there are systems that kind of come out by accident. We don't really intend them to. And those are the systems that we get caught up in, such as ideology differences and so forth. Those weren't intended to be that.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, from the get-go, from the founding fathers, they didn't want partisanship. They wanted bipartisan. Two groups of people having different points of view come up with a higher good than either one of them would do separately.
Right.
We've come up with the opposite of that. Or come up with this, and by the time we get to a common good, it's the worst thing you could possibly do. So it's
Right.
kind of a reverse synergy, kind of the opposite of synergy. I'm not sure what that word would be.
So when we talk about these created systems or systems that are put in place for this theoretical benefit of the group, when you look at the world structure, up until the last 100 years, maybe, unless you looked at colonization, you really didn't. These systems were created independently all over the world. They each had a different structured system. Now we're trying to integrate a lot of these things, and they don't fit together. It's sort of like trying to hook up a computer that was created in 1990 and trying to hook it up to something that's a supercomputer today. I mean, there's just getting them to talk to each other is no easy task. So is that part of the challenge that we're facing here? Having these systems that are disparate for the same general intent, try to work together for a good that is more universal than for the individual groups that put them in place.
Well, you have cultural differences, both ethnic culture differences, nationality cultural differences, and you also have ideological cultural differences. So if you come up with a system, if you try to homogenize, and that's what we've done to a large degree, if you try to homogenize everything into one kind of global culture, you're going to lose an awful lot of the richness of being human.
Right.
So there can be a way for a system to honor all cultures and to support all cultures in their identity, in their individual identity as individual cultures, but still have more functionality. This isn't a question of homogenization, it's a question of function.
That is very cool.
And most of the systems that we created to make our lives easier. And now we are basically slaves to the systems we created. We've created a monster. We're like Frankenstein having created the monster. And we don't know what to do with it because the monster's got more power, seemingly, than we do. And we've forgotten that we created the systems and we can change the systems. Or we can kill them and start new systems.
Right. So I think that let's pick a system and identify and talk about some of the what it was intended to be and what it's evolved to. We started to do that a little bit in terms of the political system, but I want to dig into that a little bit more deeply because I want the folks who are watching this to kind of get a feel that we're not just here talking about something theoretical and airy-fairy. I want to get into the reality of an example, and then we can extrapolate to some of the other systems because I think the same questions and key things that we're going to talk about on a system that we identify are going to be relatable to some of the other systems. So let's pick a system, and I'll let you select
Well,
something.
a system that most everybody can pick or can identify with is your corporate culture, wherever you work, whether you started the company or you're employee 10,002. A system is created as soon as two people get together to do something. You've got a system.
Okay.
So you might start out thinking that you're going to save the world, build a better mousetrap, all that sort of thing, great social conscience and so forth. And as the company grows very rapidly or grows at all, certain pecking orders get established. Perhaps somebody wants to get beat out somebody else for a promotion somewhere along, or they want to get more credit than the other person. And so you end up having these competitions within that organization, and all the brotherhood and community sense is starting to erode a little bit. And then you got gossip going on because somebody's trying to stab somebody else in the back, and then you get Wall Street involved. Boy, then it really gets nasty. So all of a sudden money's ruling the roost, and all those ideals you had as young entrepreneurs starting the company went to pot. So by the time this organization is up and running and hiring people, they don't have that same, usually, they don't have that same vision, that same set of values that the founder might have had. I mean, the founder might have just had, I want to make a ton of money, have an exit strategy, and make a ton of money and get out.
Right.
But a lot of founders, I'm thinking right now of Earl Bakken at Medtronic. When he started Medtronic, he had a very clear set of values of what he wanted the culture of that corporation to be. And it's near as I can tell, because I knew Bill George, who was the fourth successor after Earl, that culture is still pretty much intact. It has not been too badly damaged, but it's been taking a whole lot of focus, a whole lot of commitment, and a whole lot of intentionality. So Earl, I'm not sure if Earl's still alive, but for a while he would meet every new employee even after he left the chair.
Oh, wow.
Every new employee he would meet.
These, what you talked about there in that description, I think many of us that are watching, and I myself can identify with the evolution of a business. I went to work for a small company that had 15, 20 people, did some acquisitions, all sorts of things. Now you have hundreds of people and the whole culture changes and all that sort of thing. And some of that happens because you get these infusion of other parties. And like you said, looking at trying to pound their chest a little bit to say, well, we're good, we're the best ones, or whatever. We're coming into this thing, but we know what's going on, or something. How do you deal with that? I don't know, I'm stumbling for words here because I got the concept that you're describing, but I'm lacking the words to articulate how to impact positive change in an environment like that.
Well, if you have a company that you started with certain values and it's eroded, you have to make a commitment to hold those values when you start the company from the very get-go, and know that the system will tend to erode unless you still stay at it and refresh it and refresh it and refresh it and keep those values alive in that company when you start a company. Let's take so it's easy to start a socially responsible company these days and hold values. There's lots of companies doing it that are holding great values and doing good work in the world. It's another to take an organization that's been doing business this way for a couple of centuries or several decades and go in there and say, this culture is dysfunctional. It's life threatening. It actually goes against life and living systems, and I want to change it. So you're the new CEO or the new whatever, and you want to change it. That's a little more challenging project because it's not maintaining a vision that you had in the first place. It's going in and having a transformational process to go through to change the culture, consciously change the culture of that organization, and get buy-in from everybody in it.
So I'm going to extrapolate this a little bit. From the example of starting a company that has a social conscious component, and maintaining that, do you think that many of the other systems that had been established that are currently dysfunctional were intended, that the vision for their initiation was powerful and strong and righteous, and they've deteriorated, or were they maybe not quite right to begin with, or is there any way to know?
First of all, I'm guessing with whatever answer I give you. I'd say some of them, they eroded. They had a good, healthy vision beyond just making money and providing a service or a product that would help the world.
Well, let's go beyond the business. We've got some of these other systems, the education system, the political system, the monetary systems, and all sorts of things. They were, when the Federal Reserve has a systemic structure that was put in place because at the time it was put in place, it was intended to prevent another meltdown like they had in 1929. whether it has successfully, well, obviously it hasn't successfully done that as we just experienced a couple of years ago, but it seems to me that some of these systems that we put in place, the intention is righteous. It's a positive hope and expectation, but it may not turn out that way because I don't know why.
Well, the culture's changing too. The culture today is very different than it was in 1930 or 29. So part of it is recognizing the culture that we live in, because no matter what system you put in place, the thousands and hundreds of thousands of systems that exist still live in a larger system. Let's call it the U.S. system for the now, or the global system for the other ones. So I think our awareness has also increased a lot. So when you're starting something, you might have been basing that on the paradigm, the way of thinking of that system back in the 30s.
Right.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And we're in a different set now.
Right.
The paradigm that I'm advocating changing in all my books is that we've been operating in a paradigm of scarcity, fear to a large degree, and separateness and specialness.
Right.
And I'm special. I'm separate from you. I got to outbrand you in my work. Over here, we're shifting, or trying to shift, to a paradigm of connection, recognizing that we're all interconnected, and therefore there's more compassion for one another, and a sense of non-scarcity or sufficiency. Mm-hmm. Because scarcity is an illusion. It's you're talking at dinner, that's a zero-sum game.
Right.
And we can have a game where we can have a win-win. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game.
Right.
But we have to work at that, because we're not used to doing it that way. We're used to doing it this way.
Right. Because back then, when the system was put in place, potentially that was the construct of the time.
And it was men and hierarchy,
Yeah.
and all that went with the times at that time.
Right.
Now we're into flatter, we're into more collaborative cultures and so forth. So some of these systems have not only gotten dysfunctional, they're outmoded.
Right.
They need to be replaced.
You know, one of the other things that we had talked about is that when you look at this concept of maturing as a species, there have been certain examples of successful, positive, conscious evolution in a given area. Like we talked about the arts and to a certain degree the sciences, like the Renaissance period and whatnot. So it's not that we haven't done something like this before. It wasn't easy then. I don't think it's going to be easy now. But clearly we have, as a species, have moved forward in certain areas in a positive manner. Certain areas. But there's a lot of things right now that and I agree. You know, we've tended to. Let's go back to the concept of what an adolescent thinks about. We tend to be looking very much at either the me or the small group of we. And that this is, if it's not good for me, it's not good, is to a large degree the perspective. And I think we see this currently in our political system in Washington, D.C. with what's gone on in the last month or so, with these guys just throwing verbal darts at each other as opposed to looking to try to figure out
forgetting who they're working for.
Forgetting who they're working for one thing, yeah. And there isn't a problem. Another thing that you and I had mentioned earlier, but I can't think of a problem that has only one solution. Maybe a math problem. 2 + 2 does equal 4. It's hard to do it a different way, but a problem that faces us, there's always more than one way to find a way to achieve a positive, uplifting solution. It doesn't have to just go in one linear way. There are multiple ways to get there, I think. But I don't think we think about that anymore either. It's either my way or the highway.
Well,
so many times.
Typically, yeah. One of the things I'd like to inject in here is one of the enemies of any real major social change, paradigm change or otherwise, is the dynamic of familiarity. We are so attached to what's familiar to us that to change from that, we have to either be pushed with a lot of pain or pulled with a lot of force by something that's really compelling. But otherwise, we know lots and lots of cases where people will stay in painful positions, marriages, jobs, etc., because it's familiar, it's known territory, rather than shifting to something else, like a different paradigm that isn't fully formed, and not knowing how it's going to turn out. So that's another part of being an adult, is you've been through this a few times. You know that you've been through the valley of uncertainty a few times, and it's worked out. You didn't die. But when you haven't been through that, you don't know that.
Right.
So the way I map a paradigm change is that the paradigm we are in is starting to fail. A lot of people are trying to keep it going a little longer, and that's what consultants do, and they get very well paid for it. You know, keep the way I explain how everything works alive a little longer so I can keep relying on it.
Right.
But there's others of us that have been trying to build this new paradigm and get buy-in for that, and it's just starting to take off now. But there's not as much money in that as there is in trying to keep the old one alive. But the reason people throw all that money in there is that it's familiar. They know this paradigm. They know how that explains the way the world works.
Right.
Well, it's not explaining it very well anymore.
I guess I'm going to interject that there's probably also a level of fear that if there is a change, then I'm going to lose. That's that whole back to the, the we/they type of thing, that it's a zero sum as opposed to a.
Well, I've got this figured out. You know,
Right.
I'm vice president of my company. I'm the father of 2 kids, both going to college. Whatever it is, I've got this figured out, and it's working pretty well for me.
Yeah.
So I don't want to jump to another ship or another boat or another
Right.
dock because I don't know what that's going to be. I mean,
Well, what's the danger of not making that shift?
a great extinction.
Okay.
Did that get your attention? No, we could end up being a relatively small number of human beings left on the planet, living someplace where we never would think of living, because now that's where the temperature supports human life. And we may lose a few people. That's the worst case. We may have a revolution between the haves and the have-nots, because there's more and more have-nots are populating, and there's fewer, the percentage of the real haves is getting smaller. So eventually they're going to say, the natives are going to say, hey, we outnumber them by millions to one.
Right.
What are we doing with it, putting up with this
It
for?
happened in France once upon a time.
Once upon a time.
And it's not the only place that something like that
But this system, the way things are going, it's not sustainable. I don't know, I haven't got a crystal ball to say how much longer it'll sustain, but
Right.
eventually something's going to come along that's going to cause a big shift,
Right.
either downward or upward. I'd rather go upward.
So the concept of maturity, being responsible for humanity's future, the great growing up. By the way, I'm going to hold up this book because it's the
There you
first time
go.
I've done this. And I'm going to, as I do this, I'm going to let the audience know that they can send us questions and things that will go to you. If they send questions to me at info@referencepointtv.com, we'll certainly get that, to find out information about the book, and if they have any questions about the sort of things we're talking about here today. But I want to get back to maturity and the maturation process. When we look at physical maturity is one thing, but we were talking about earlier, there's emotional maturity, spiritual maturity, social maturity, and whatever. Can we identify the kinds of either things, activities, or thought processes that help facilitate maturation in some of these non-physical arenas?
The adolescent is typically known for having very little tolerance for delayed gratification. They want it right now.
Right.
They want to hang out with certain people that think the way they do because they fit in, so they want to fit in. They don't want to talk about next year or the year after that or 4 years after that. They want to talk about Friday night and the dance or whatever it is. So they have very short-term attention spans. They like instant gratification, and those are just 2 or 3 of the characteristics. That's the way we are living right now. We want it all now, especially with technology empowering that. Poor Amazon's doing a great job, by the way. They get you a book in 2 days, which blows me away. And I don't even have to leave my living room. But there's a lot of our everyday activities that are based on adolescent behavior, that short-term the unwillingness to make an investment in our future long term.
Okay.
That's one example of it. Another one is we don't think very long range. We don't plan things out very well, or we'd be looking at our global commons a lot differently right now.
Right. It's interesting because I think that concept you just talked about, more the the instant gratification, the short-term perspective, that seems to be a Western culture phenomenon a little bit more solidly than an Asian culture phenomenon, where they're planning for 100 years from now, the next generation, at least they used to. I don't know to the degree they're doing that right now.
They used to.
They used to.
Yeah, there used to be a great gap between U.S. The gap between salaries for CEOs and the average paid employee, and it was very, very different in Japan. Japan's catching up with us. So we are homogenizing the world to some degree. But there are other characteristics of adolescent behavior. One very common one is gossip. And if you look at how much time we spend talking to each other about something, some trial, something that's in the news that has no social benefit at all, other than kind of gossipy.
Facebook and Twitter are really
they enable gossip a lot.
They've done some other positive things, but there is that opportunity for that. We're just about done with our time on this segment of the show, we're just barely scratching the surface here. So I want to let the folks watching know that we are going to have a complete second segment about this topic, and so you'll see it the next time Reference Point airs. So, okay, so. Yeah, I can see that we've got a reality of an adolescent mindset in terms of a lot of the activities as they pertain to the systems that are supposed to be there for our us as a species to move forward. So when we come back at our next part of the discussion, John, I'd like to take a little bit deeper look into how we might be able to consciously make that change for forward progress. So
great.
We'll do that. And ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be our next topic. John, thank you for being here. Stick around. We're going to do this again here in a little bit, and we'll see you next time on Reference Point.
Great.